that veganism, that plunge, really inspired me to experiment more with my cooking and explore other vegetables, explore other fruits that I wasn't eating. And I found that when I eliminated the dairy, I included more fruits and vegetables than I ever really ate before. And in fact, I thought my diet was more diverse just by eliminating the dairy. And I haven't looked back since.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want. Our guest today, Dr. Sheil Shukla, practices internal medicine at Northwestern Medicine in Illinois. But within him beats the heart of a true artist, and it's apparent in everything he does, whether it's treating patients or photographing mouth-watering meals that he's prepared for his 60,000 followers on Instagram. Dr. Shukla is also a contributor at the culinary publication Best of Vegan. He's been featured in Veg News, Forks Over Knives, and Thrive magazine. And now with his new book, Plant-Based India, he highlights the wonderful healing foods of the Indian continent, sharing recipes that he grew up with. I'm extra excited about this interview today because not only have I always loved how flavorful vegan-friendly Indian food can be, but I've also been really curious about Indian culture, especially when it comes to cows and veganism. And what a great opportunity this is to discuss the potential health benefits of this beautiful, delicious cuisine, as interpreted by our guest, Dr. Shukla himself. Welcome to the show.
Alexandra, Dotsie, thank you so much for having me. So happy to be on your show today.
Well, we're excited too. And you were born in Wisconsin, but your parents were from India, right? And they immigrated here?
That's right. So I was born in the southeastern portion of Wisconsin. My parents, they were both born and raised in Gujarat, India, which is a northwestern state of India.
And a lot of the food in your cookbook, it comes from that region. But you were raised, even though you're American, you were raised with an appreciation of Indian culture, especially because your grandmother lived with you for a while when you were younger. So as I said in the intro, I've always been curious about the role of vegetarianism and veganism in India, and how it features in the cuisine. Apparently, doing some research, India is the most vegetarian country in the world, the largest percentage of people. And I think a lot of people wouldn't be surprised by that, but we're also curious about how veganism features in there because there's a lot of ghee and delicious yogurt things also that are featured really highly in the Indian cuisine. So I'm not sure how much veganism is in the Indian culture.
Sure. So vegetarianism is certainly huge in India on religious traditions. So specifically certain Hindu practices, particularly Jain practices, and many Buddhist practices as well. A lot of that tends to, promote vegetarianism or sort of limit animal cruelty as much as possible. And that's kind of where the vegetarianism comes. I will say, just because you're Hindu doesn't mean you're vegetarian. I think that's a common misconception as well. Nonetheless, because India is predominantly Hindu and because of the other religions that use vegetarianism. That's kind of a primary reason why vegetarianism is so popular in India. And really, that kind of translated to my own family in the fact that both of my parents were vegetarian when they grew up, and they took that with them when they came to the US. And ultimately, when they came over to the US, that was kind of in the 70s, 80s, they were kind of drawn to trying meat because a lot of their friends they had made in the US, whether it was peer pressure or whatnot, they ended up, indulging in meat every so often because of, I guess, the societal pressure of being in the US and being immigrants to this country. Ultimately, they've both since adopted vegetarianism again. Growing up, we were mainly vegetarian at home, particularly my grandmother. She was a strict vegetarian. And the meals that we ate at home were always vegetarian. I was typically, for the most part, vegetarian at that time as well.
What does Hinduism believe about being vegetarian? Because you said, certainly not everyone that's Hindu is vegetarian, but I don't know what the actual Sanskrit or scripts say about. I've never read them. What does Hinduism teach?
Sure. I would say the general message is a message of ahimsa, which is nonviolence. So ahimsa is the Sanskrit term, which essentially translates to no violence. And that's really kind of the underlying sentiment behind vegetarianism in Hindu tradition, that there's a goal to try to limit as much violence as possible, and that means violence not only to ourselves but also toward other humans, but other beings as well, and that includes animals and even insects to some degree as well.
Okay. What are the laws around eating bovines meat in India? Because I've read that all but 2 states outlaw the eating of cows, but you can eat ox and buffalo. And of course, there are Muslims in India who eat cow beef. And I think the lowest caste, the caste system is illegal now, but apparently it still functions in the culture. And the lowest caste Dalit does eat beef. Can you share with us a little bit about where the cow is in culture in India?
Yeah, and I can speak to this to a certain degree because I've been to India a few times. Now, obviously, I don't live in India. I wasn't born in India. So I don't have a clear crystal picture as to what exactly the situation is there. So I will kind of give a caveat that this is through my lens, and there are many other lenses to approach this. But in terms of how how cows are treated in India, generally it's of high respect. My experience with going to India, it's seeing cows associated with Hindu temples, and many Hindu temples have a few cows that are residing kind of near the temple, which are given ultimately great care, and calves and things like that. So really no clear violence that I personally witnessed, and nothing that I really know that's associated with that sort of cows that are treated in the Hindu temples themselves. Outside of that, though, the dairy industry in India is huge. The consumption of dairy products is very important, I would say, to the culture there. And you mentioned ghee, yogurt, those things are consumed quite extensively. So I can't really speak to whether that is an ethical practice or not. Ultimately, when it comes to the production of dairy, we know that there is almost an essential piece, which is artificial insemination. And I can't really say for certain whether that's done or not in India. And ultimately, I think the reasons for going vegan should still stand in India, whether the cows are treated nicely or not, because it ultimately comes down to that essential requirement of the dairy industry. So in that sense, on the micro scale, cows are certainly treated with great respect. Now, on the grander side of things, when it comes to the dairy industry in general in India, it's difficult to say whether that's better than what it is in the US.
Mm. But the ghee and the yogurt come from cows, not ox or buffalo. A friend of mine who is also of Indian descent, but is American, was born here. His parents immigrated here too. He said that, unfortunately, buffalo and oxen are often used to replace cows and are treated, just abominably like we do here in the United States and basically all other countries who have factory farms.
Yeah, I would say that's probably true. The dairy in India certainly comes from, ox and bull as well. So, other forms of bovine animals, not just cows.
Oh, but they do have cows that they take the milk from, and it's okay because it's not killing the animal.
That's my understanding.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have one more question about. I'm really curious about ghee. I have this fabulous across the street neighbor who I just love. It's an Indian family, and oh my gosh, she knocked on my door on Monday night for it was to celebrate Diwali, the Hindu festival of lights, and it gave me this wonderful care package of all these sweet treats that she had made. I think one of them was called barfi. They were very sweet, but she was lovely and made them for me with coconut milk because she knows I'm vegan. She actually went vegan to come out of breast cancer about 5-6 years ago. And so she'll say to me now, I don't call myself vegan because I eat ghee, but she doesn't eat other dairy. And I've heard different people say something, oh, but the ghee, is it sacred in India? What is the draw? What is it actually? And why does it have this almost like mystic kind of flavor around it?
Yeah, I would say mystic is kind of a fair description of it. And, certainly I have that experience as well with many family members who are really devoted to using ghee in desserts, in various dishes in general. So what ghee is for the other listeners who may not know, ghee is clarified butter. So it starts with just standard butter that's essentially boiled down so that it removes the excess water, and you essentially are left with pure milk fat. Now, supposedly there may be, beneficial qualities to it. I disagree with that. I guess supposedly there are medicinal qualities to it, and that's kind of where that tradition comes about. And it's also used traditionally in Hindu rituals. It's often used to, not only be used in desserts that are used in the Hindu rituals, but also just as a substance used, I guess, for various things such as lighting vivos, which is like a candle almost. So that, butter fat is used to light a wick, for example. Now, of course, me as a vegan, I don't agree with that. We know for certain that milk fat is extremely high in saturated fat, extremely high in cholesterol. And we know that these things are linked to heart disease in the sense that it raises LDL cholesterol. There's a fairly clear link to that. So, these are the reasons why I've moved away from it. And that's kind of why it goes down to kind of the mystical quality of ghee. And a lot of that comes to, a lot of people grew up eating ghee in desserts. And to an extent, it's nostalgia. And that's why I find people are so committed to continuing using ghee. I think it generally comes down to the nostalgia part of things.
Yeah, cultural and familial. I think that ends up being almost all the foods that people have a hard time letting go of, right? It's that nostalgia, that memory, your mother, grandmother, the culture, the experience. I get it. Yeah,
exactly. And I get it too. And, I think obviously we have a million alternatives for ghee. And I think
really?
It's just some stuff. Yeah.
I didn't even know that. There's a coconut or soy or whatever ghee, or how do they?
Yeah. So, one that I can think of, a more popular version is a combination of coconut and avocado oil is like a ghee replacement. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that either.
Right.
It's not necessarily a healthy alternative.
No.
But that is a more ethical alternative, I would say, potentially, for people that require that for a nostalgia point of view or for certain holidays, that sort of thing. It may be a worthwhile alternative for that purpose. Of course, also, extra virgin olive oil, in small amounts can also be used to replace ghee in a quite effective way.
Thank you for that. Now I feel like I'm up on ghee now because I just had no idea. So appreciate it.
You can share it with your neighbor, Dotsie.
No, all I know now.
Dr. Shukla, what was your inspiration for going vegan? You were already vegetarian. Your whole family and your culture is mostly vegetarian, but you went that one step farther.
Yeah, so to clarify, I grew up predominantly vegetarian, but I did eat meat throughout, I guess, elementary and middle school. My parents had fed us meat. We would, like many other children, like our drive-through chicken nuggets, for example, and we would not want to be like the other kids in our classroom and eat the meat and that they were eating. So I was not purely vegetarian at that time. We would have meat. Now, ultimately, in high school, I decided to become vegetarian, partly from a traditional cultural standpoint. My parents were predominantly vegetarian. My grandmother, like I said, was strictly vegetarian. And that was an inspiration for me to go vegetarian as well. In college, that's when I started cooking more for myself. And in college, kind of my senior year of college, junior year of college, is when I was exposed to the documentaries that many of us know, Forks Over Knives being one of them. And that really opened my eyes to what I was eating, what it meant in terms of the environment, what it meant in terms of my health. And that is what really inspired me to go vegan, really just watching a few documentaries. And ultimately, New Year's Eve, one day after eating or after watching a few of the documentaries, I decided to make this vegan mac and cheese just to see if I could do the veganism. And a lot of it was just an experiment to see, can I actually even do this? And since then, I never looked back. I had that mac and cheese, and honestly, I hated it. It just didn't work out. But still, I was like, this is a challenge I can handle. And I kind of grew from there. And honestly, that veganism, that plunge, really inspired me to experiment more with my cooking and explore other vegetables, explore other fruits that I wasn't eating. And I found that when I eliminated the dairy, I included more fruits and vegetables than I ever really ate before. And in fact, I thought my diet was more diverse just by eliminating the dairy. And I haven't looked back since.
You're also a doctor. What kind of issues do you see most among your patients?
Absolutely. So I am an outpatient internal medicine physician. That means that I see purely adults above the age of 18, really no age limit. I have patients above the age of 100. And of course, the most common things that I see on a day-to-day basis, pretty much every single day, is high blood pressure, high cholesterol, people with heart disease in general, people that have had heart attacks, people have had strokes before. That's kind of the most common things that I see. And we know there's a clear link with diet, the foods that we eat, and these chronic diseases. And I incorporate nutrition in my practice on a nearly daily basis as well. A lot of my patients are seeing me for their annual checkup. We do routine blood work, which typically includes a cholesterol check, diabetes screening, blood tests. And when we find people in the borderline range, that's kind of my favorite range to treat. The age between 30 and 60 is kind of the most common age where we see people in that borderline range. And for me, it's all about prevention. And it's about educating the patient that there is a link between diet, and there's a huge impact you can make by dietary changes sooner rather than later.
And how do you help your patients change? Now you can hand them your cookbook, but it's not easy. You don't get to see patients for very long. And so inspiring people to change and stick with it is a challenge, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I think time is certainly a limiting factor. For me as a primary care physician, I certainly have to see numerous patients in a day, and time is limited. I will say I have a little bit more time in the annual visits. That's where our appointments are generally longer, or when I'm seeing patients for the first time, the appointments are generally longer. So I have a few extra minutes to kind of give my pitch on nutrition. What I generally start with is to get a nutrition baseline. So I always ask an open-ended question to all my new patients, kind of, what does your diet look like? And, some patients are going to want to talk about it more. Some patients may not. And I like to start with where the patient's at, try to meet them where they're at, and not to be pushy toward any diet in particular. I get that kind of baseline, then we do our routine blood work, and then we look back at the diet and see, is there anything that can explain the abnormalities in the labs that we see? And if so, that's when I really say, we should make some changes here. And whether that means having them come back for a follow-up to discuss things in more detail, creating a diet log, having them write down what they're eating on a day-to-day basis, that's really a place where I can kind of point out what the culprits might be in explaining some of their abnormal blood work.
I'm curious as to many of your patients, their believability, or how much they really soak in and tend to then understand the hows and the whys that diet could have any kind of place, right, in healing. My mom's having some gut issues, and her gastroenterologist said straight to her face that what you eat has nothing to do with what's going on in your gut. And I was just thinking, after she told me that you could know nothing about nutrition, right? You could have just gone to Western medical school and have no stats, no evidence, no data, have never read anything on how diet can affect, but just that the gut doctor is saying that that what's in the gut has nothing to do with the actual main function of why we have a gut, which I think is to digest food and disperse nutrients. And so sometimes it's just not even logical. The Western medicine, the way that it's like, that just doesn't even make any sense, that what you put in the gut, whose entire job is to take food and do what it's going to do with it, would have nothing to do with what you put in it. Why do you think this emphasis on diet is so absent in Western medicine? And yeah, we know they don't get taught much in medical school, but why aren't so many doctors looking further, looking deeper, looking for more answers?
I'm kind of surprised by that. That hasn't really been my experience with sending people to specialists, especially GI. The GI doctors that I've worked do have a fair emphasis on diet and nutrition. I at least see that in their notes. They're recommending a high fiber diet. Pretty much in every GI note that I've ever read in my current practice says encourages a high fiber diet. We know that that's good for us. And that's really great to see. Now, whether they've been truly counseled on it, that's kind of where I come in, where I might have a little more time to kind of delve into that. So I'm kind of surprised by that approach. But I will say there is certainly a lack of nutrition training in Western medical schools. And my medical school was no different. I didn't really have any focused nutrition training, but I think that's also changing. There are medical schools now that have nutrition classes. There are physicians that certainly promote nutrition, physicians such as myself that are really into nutrition as an adjunct to the medications and all the traditional medical therapies that we have. I think that that's changing. Now, to speak onto why nutrition has never really been a focus, I have one theory, which I don't even know if this is true, but medical school is really all about exams. It's about passing the boards, and that's really important for medical schools as well. As obviously we need to pass our boards and pass the routine sort of medical boards that are required to do medical practice in the US. And obviously that's a great thing, to regulate medical practice in that way and kind of have that regulation to be able to prescribe the medications that we are. Certainly that's very warranted and very necessary. Now, those boards do not include anything whatsoever about nutrition. So what I suspect is that it comes down to, the students don't need this to pass their boards. Why do we need to spend the resources, spend the time teaching students about nutrition? So I think that's where that comes, or that's where it was before at some point. That's just one theory. Again, I don't know if that stands true or not. It seems to stand true kind of when I went through med school. Again, the main focus was about studying for every test every week and kind of passing through every stage of the game. Ultimately now, like I said, I think that's changing. I think a lot of people are coming to realize that there is a clear link between nutrition and chronic medical conditions. And that's where we're seeing an emergence of nutrition clubs in medical school. I actually just had a medical student from my medical school reach out to me saying they just started a nutrition club, and it's led by one of the faculty there that's really into nutrition as well. So it's really changing now, at least over the past few years. It's awesome to see that.
That's great. Do you tell your patients how you eat as a way to help them, see you as a person with some knowledge, about eating more vegetables and fruit, or and that do you talk about your cooking? Because I'm sure I would think a lot of people would feel overwhelmed, like it's too hard, it takes too much time. So you might have to use your own experience.
Yeah, I will say that's certainly an approach that I use for people that are not my patients in terms of leading by example. So people see what I eat just because of what I post on Instagram, and that's why I have the Instagram account. So I will say with my own experience, that kind of comes to a wider audience that I reach with my Instagram community as opposed to my patients. I will say for my patients, I like to give a much more focal or intense approach, very specific to them. So that's looking at their diet logs, and I try to focus that appointment less on me and more about them. So I can't say that I necessarily use me as an example on a day-to-day basis when I'm reviewing patients' nutrition logs. I think to an extent there's just not enough time to do that, and that's why I do that on a more broad scale, to reach more people in that sense.
Okay, let's talk about your cookbook. So give us an overview of your new cookbook, which is called Plant-Based India, Nourishing Recipes Rooted in Tradition.
Absolutely. So this cookbook came after many years of cooking from my dorm room to my apartments to now my home. Many years of learning recipes from my family, experimenting on my own. In college is when I really delved more into cooking and the art of cooking. So not only the joy of cooking and eating, but also the artistry that comes behind it. Science and art make up cooking in the same way that science and art make up medicine, and that's why I love all of it. So this cookbook came as kind of a product of all the years of experience from cooking and my explorations with food, travels to India, documenting what I describe as my culinary heritage, which I describe as the foods that I ate growing up and the foods of my family. And this book was, that product of that love, the product of that cooking, the product of many years of experience with cooking. And that's where kind of my inspiration in bringing it about.
Do you have a favorite recipe in there?
Yeah, one of my favorite recipes. So the most common Indian foods that people enjoy, at least in the United States, are the rich, creamy gravy dishes, often known as curries. And one of those dishes is called Matar Paneer. And that's kind of a rich gravy with onions, tomatoes, generally heavy cream, and paneer, which is a cheese. So I veganized it, of course. Cut out the dairy, added a small amount of cashews to get that richness. Uses tofu instead of paneer, and green peas, and that's a very rich dish that is, I think, true to the original, and it happens to be one of my wife's favorites as well. And really, that's probably one of my favorite recipes in the book as well.
I'm curious as to why you chose the term plant-based instead of vegan. Did you have to think about that a bit, or?
I always chose the term plant-based, at least when I was starting out. And that's what led to the Instagram handle, which I go by today, which is plant-based artist. And ultimately, I kind of stuck with that term. The book itself, again, I use the term plant-based just to make it more approachable. And it's very clear when you read the book that it's a strictly vegan cookbook. I talk about veganism in the introduction. But again, for the title itself, I chose plant-based mainly because I think it's a little more approachable for a wider audience.
You use a lot of spices in your cookbook, of course. And can you give us some examples of the health properties of some of the spices that are used in Indian cuisine?
Absolutely. There's so much that can be said about spices. Really, pretty much any spice you talk about is going to have some beneficial health aspects to it. So we know that curcumin, the active compound in turmeric, is anti-inflammatory, antibacterial. There are many positive impacts from that. That's widely known, widely accepted. And the similar thing can be said about any spices in general, really even cinnamon, the role in, blood sugar control with cinnamon, for example. These are things that have been well established and there's not really much debate around it. And for that reason, I definitely did not shy away from including spices throughout the book. And nowadays, spices are so accessible to many people. It's so easy to find spices. And you'll see all the commonly used spices, such as cumin, coriander, turmeric, cinnamon, widely used throughout the book with no hesitation. Now, I also delved into other less commonly used spices, such as black cardamom, bay leaves, for example, things that might not be in everyone's pantry, but I use them in the recipes in the book. And I say they're optional if they're difficult to find or if you don't want to keep them on hand. But I definitely did not want to water down the recipes of my childhood just by leaving out a couple of spices to make it, quote, easier to make. And in that sense, I think spices add so much nuance to a dish that you're eating, and not only the health benefits, but the flavor. And that's really what it comes down to, is you get so much flavor, so much nuance in the food. And that's why I definitely didn't shy away from using spices, because spices also, just because something has spices doesn't mean it's spicy. Oftentimes that kind of brings up another topic, but oftentimes people ask me, are the dishes spicy? And it's tough to answer that question. I mean, yeah, they're spicy because they have spices, but does it mean they're hot or inedible? No. I mean, you can make a dish as hot as you want, that the heat comes from the red chilies or the green chilies, and you can certainly omit them if you want to.
If you mentioned that some people might not want to have spices on hand because maybe they don't cook Indian a lot, but tell us, what would you recommend be one spice that somebody keep in their cupboard that they might not know about?
Yeah, that's an easy answer. And that one is garam masala. So garam masala is a spice blend, oftentimes from 8 to 12 different spices in just one blend. It's very easy to find at your local Indian grocery store. And typically you can find it in Western grocery stores too. So I've seen a lot of garam masalas in Western grocery stores that seem inauthentic. So one I saw the other day had things like red chili, turmeric, saffron, which those three things are really not in many garam masalas, especially not mine. It's just not the right flavor profile. So when you're looking for a garam masala, again, this kind of gives so much nuance, so much depth of flavor to Indian food because it's made up of so many different spices. So it includes cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, coriander, cumin. You want to look for those spices in the ingredient list, because those spices in particular add that depth of flavor without making a dish, quote, spicy or hot. That comes from the red chili, which you would add separately. So I would say if there's any one sort of spice blend you would want to keep on hand if you're just getting used to Indian cuisine, it would be garam masala.
Okay. I'm super curious as to your thoughts on the nightshades. I hate when people hate on the red peppers and eggplant and potatoes and all my favorite foods. And the last time I was at an event not too long ago, I don't know, it was weird. It was mostly vegans there. It was a mindful eating film festival. And there were a lot of people I was like, I thought that was a thing of the past, that people were like, oh, nightshades. But there's kind of a lot of people that were inquiring and talking about it. So yeah, set it straight.
I just think that's kind of silly to omit fruits and vegetables from the diet. And I think it's oftentimes kind of silly to see these reports that I've seen from patients with, sensitivities to 1 million vegetables and fruits. I think it, to an extent, it drives people insane, avoiding so many things, and it becomes ultimately overly restrictive to an extent. Sure, there might be reason to avoid certain things in terms of GI conditions where you might want to avoid certain things and, things that might be more triggersome. Now, ultimately for the general population, is avoiding nightshades going to be beneficial? Probably not. I think you're probably limiting yourself too much on things that are very helpful and beneficial overall. And I think the whole nightshade thing, I certainly don't promote. I'm not about.
I don't understand it, because the common sort of theme in it is that they are inflammatory, and I feel very uninflamed. So I can probably eat a lot of those three foods. I don't get it. I have never seen any data either. And anybody I've ever asked that says they don't have them, and I say, oh gosh, will you share the data? Because I've never seen anything. There isn't anything. There's just so-and-so is doing it. Or, Tom Brady kind of, darn it, Tom, we love you for lots of reasons, but it's a nightshade thing. I feel like started with that, but I've never gotten a good explanation that makes any sense. Anyway, yeah. Okay.
You talked about replacing ghee with all sorts of vegan alternatives and paneer, the cheese, you use tofu. Can you give us some other examples of how you veganized your dishes in the book?
Vegan substitutions for dairy often include nuts as kind of the basis to get that richness, the creaminess. So instead of heavy cream, the easy substitute is cashew cream, just cashews blended with water, as simple as that. Pretty much if you're vegan, you probably know about cashews. Other nuts can also be used, such as almonds. So there are dishes where I use almonds instead of cashews. I generally tend to prefer cashews, again, because of the environmental impact of almonds. But does that mean I don't use any almonds? Not necessarily. Predominantly cashews. I will say hemp seeds, sunflower seeds. There are a couple dishes that use that to kind of create that creaminess, that richness, especially for folks with nut allergies. And from a environmental standpoint, as far as I'm aware, those would be better choices as well. In addition to that, extra virgin olive oil, when used in smaller quantities, can be replaced be used in place of the large quantities of ghee. So I use that in the cookbook as well. And yogurt is another huge thing. So soy yogurts are excellent. For whatever reason, I found them very hard to find nowadays. I feel like they were more common previously. So I don't know exactly why that might be, but I am a big fan of soy yogurt, unsweetened soy yogurt. I think that's an excellent choice. And of course, cashew yogurt, coconut yogurts, those are other alternatives that can be used instead of dairy yogurt.
What about fats? I heard you give us a little subtle warning about having too much fat, but I heard, coconut oil. And how do you feel about fats? And if somebody wants to cut down on fats, can they make their dishes less fatty?
Right. I would say my approach is in line with just how I eat, how I cook for my family. I understand the merit of a strictly fat-free or a oil-free diet, rather, not fat-free, oil-free diet. I think there's certainly merit to that. And we kind of know from many plant-based nutrition experts that a completely oil-free diet can be effective. Now, from a practical standpoint, that just hasn't worked for me and my family. And that for that reason, we do include small amounts of oils. So I think that's kind of where we should look into the qualities of oils. I would say, there is benefit to excluding oil altogether. But if you are going to use my oil, to be mindful of it. So avoiding things that have palm oil and coconut oil, I would say those are the biggest culprits, which with a more clear link to raising cholesterol levels. Those are very high in saturated fat. Those are things to avoid. You want to look for the oils that are as least processed as possible as well, which is why typically an extra virgin olive oil is going to be a better option when compared to things like animal fats, of course, and coconut oil, that sort of thing.
What's a neutral oil? You use that
Sure.
term.
Yeah, I use a neutral oil, especially when it comes to when you're heating things slightly at a higher temperature, such as with roasting. Typically, I wouldn't use an extra virgin olive oil for that. For those, I typically tend to use like a grapeseed oil and that sort of thing, like a grapeseed or sunflower oil.
So I don't understand the neutral. It's just neutral means that it's an oil that can be heated at high temperatures.
Neutral flavor.
Okay.
Tends to have a more robust flavor. When I use the term neutral, it just means neutral in flavor.
Right. Okay. Can extra virgin olive oil be heated at high heats? I've heard various thinking on that.
There's various thinking on that, definitely. One thought is that there's this lower smoke point for extra virgin olive oil. I would say it's probably better. You're probably better off not to heat it at higher temperatures. I do find that it can, alter the taste of it as well. So generally speaking, I would say a good quality extra virgin olive oil, you wouldn't want to heat at a higher temperature.
Okay. Your bio says you're a recipe developer. So tell us what it takes what are the steps to develop a recipe? I'd like to be on the tail end of those steps, like tasting. Except for maybe not your early mac and cheese, but I'm sure your mac and cheese now.
I bet it was good. He just doesn't realize.
My mac and cheese now I'm definitely more proud of. The mac and cheese I used at that time, I don't know what the basis was or what even recipe I used for that. But anyway, when it comes to recipe testing, at least for the cookbook, I started off with flavor memories, things that I remember eating that my grandmother made. And unfortunately, I never really had the experience of cooking as much with my grandmother. By the time I really got into cooking myself, she had passed at that point, which I think a lot of it comes down to the flavor memories, those experiences of the foods that she created for us. And for whatever reason, I'm lucky to have a palate that's able to recreate that in terms of a process. So, recalling those foods and kind of getting a general idea, whether it's a phone call to my mom at home and asking her, how did my grandmother make this? And she can kind of tell me, okay, add a little bit of this, add a little bit of that, give me the general ingredients. And then I take it from there and make it once or twice. And, usually it tends to work. Sometimes, of course, there are failures, but generally, from the experience of cooking for so many years, I'm generally able to come up with something. And, whether it takes a few tries, that's kind of where that initial sort of recipe comes about. And typically my first try or second try, I don't write down anything. It's kind of all in my head in terms of how much to put. I try to do it more naturally, because that's how my mother did it. That's how my grandmother did it, is more of a, what does it feel like, taste as I go, figure things out as it's happening. On my third or fourth attempt is when I would write things down and say a cup of this, a teaspoon of this, that sort of thing. And that's when I translate what's going on in my head onto paper. And after that, at least my process for developing recipes for the book, it went to a group of recipe testers.
Your friends or professionals?
So that's when I reached out to the Instagram community to see, and it was volunteer based. So that's when I had, I think, over like 250 responses to a question. That's when I had to just cut off the responses. So I stopped it at 250, and then I kind of tapered down, I cut down the number a little bit further to maybe about 50 testers.
And these are all have to be local too, right? So these are just the local people, the people all over the country. You would have gotten way more if you were able to send it to them in the mail.
Yeah, well, actually.
Well, no, they had to make it, right?
Exactly. They had to make it.
So they make it. I see. Oh,
exactly. So they weren't taste testers. They were recipe testers. So they tested the whole process. So I sent them the recipe. They would pick up the ingredients and make it in their own home and then give me feedback. And at that point, I would say, yes, this is a good recipe. And we continued on, or no, this needs some more work. And there's a handful where I said, this recipe is just not going to work. It's just not practical. And I scrapped some. So that was my group of testers, and they were around the world. So there are people from east to west coast of the US, people in Europe, people in India, and to make sure that these recipes were translatable to people of different experience levels. So people from beginner, meaning they've never really cooked before, to professional chefs. So I tried to have a really diverse group in the sense of where they're coming from, what their background is, and just to make sure that these recipes are going to be effective and translatable to many home kitchens. And that was the goal with that.
And so I'm curious, so that must have been a lot of work. How many recipes do you have in the book? And how many did you have to really work, how many came out perfectly, I guess, the first time where you went, this is exactly right?
Yeah. There are over 100 recipes in the book, technically speaking. I would say some of them are for sauces and spice blends. And so those are a little bit less complicated because I had them fairly well developed to begin with. But over 100 recipes, and each tester tested maybe 2 to 6 recipes each. So each recipe was tested by myself at least 2 or 3 times through the development process, and then by the individual testers. I would say at least 2 to 3 testers for each recipe. And then I would test it maybe one time after that when I was doing the photography for the book. In that sense, it was doing the photography, but also testing it one more time just to be totally sure. So rest assured that if you do pick up a copy of the book, the recipes have been very well tested.
Yeah.
That's good. Since we're beginners, right, Alexandra? You mentioned your photography, and you have incredibly beautiful photos. And I learned early on from Chef Megan Sad how to take a picture of a Buddha bowl. That I usually kind of just eat in like layers of flavors in a bowl. Like I just like to eat that because they're usually pretty large and just fit it all in. And I mix the things up. So if it's corn and avocado and black beans and, chili peppers and tortilla chips, it's just all together. Well, when you take a picture of that, it looks like barf. It's terrible. So she taught me, like, when you do bowls, you do like the corn and the avocado and the black beans right next to each other around the bowl with the beautiful cilantro or whatever in the middle. So that's tip one for people from moi. But I am so dying to know your hints, because there's a lot of people listening that like to take pictures of their vegan food, right, and share it and encourage people. So what are the top your top 3 tips on how to take a great food photo?
Sure. I think photography is just so fun. I think the first tip is just to have fun with it and not to overthink it, and just enjoy what you're doing. I think that's kind of the number 1 tip. Number 2 tip is to really be mindful of the dishes that you're using. I have developed kind of this collection, not that you necessarily need a full collection of dishes, but having a fairly diverse collection of dishes that you like, and that kind of plays a big role in terms of making the food pop a little bit better. So
you use gray a lot. Use gray dishes because that brings out the color, you say.
Precisely. So I use a lot of gray dishware. I tend to use a gray backdrop for my photos as well, just to let the food shine as much as possible, to highlight the colors. The third tip I would say is, especially for the gravy dishes in Indian cuisine. So when I talked about the mutton tofu, you can mix the peas in, but when I was photographing the mutton tofu for my recipe, I combined it or plated it or showed it with a few things that you can serve it with, in addition to putting a few defrosted peas on top to clarify that that's what was in there, because otherwise it can be kind of hidden in the sauce. And in addition, putting some cilantro for garnish. Using herbs are a great way to kind of bring out the color in a dish. Adding additional spices on top just for garnish. So on that recipe, if I can remember the photograph, adding some red chili flakes, adding cilantro, adding those defrosted peas. So that adds a lot of vibrancy to the dish that's otherwise kind of a neutral yellowish red color.
It's like highlighting what's in there, because it's like a curry. It looks soupy. Okay.
I always have trouble. Okay, I take it with my phone, right? I'm sure you have a fancy camera and everything, but I almost have to get rid of my shadow and the camera's shadow.
Oh, yeah.
That's the hardest part. What do you recommend there? Better lighting?
I tend to use natural light. So try to do something closer to a window. Of course, with the sun setting earlier nowadays, that can be a little more difficult, but natural light would be ideal, especially if you're taking a photograph with your phone. Of course, there is some benefit to doing artificial lights, but that's generally more in a professional setting. But if you're taking it just on your phone, I would say natural light is the way to go. And it can be quite fun to shoot with natural light, even direct natural light. A lot of pictures that you see on Instagram have those harsh shadows, and there can be a nice aesthetic to that too.
So tell our audience where they can find you on your beautiful, beautiful Instagram page with so many mouth-watering photos of food that is in your book.
Well, thank you for your kind words. You can find me on my Instagram, plant-based artist. That's my Instagram handle, and you'll see all my photographs there. Many of them are from the book, and my book itself is really the place where you'll find the majority of my recipes as well.
Great, thank you.
And if somebody wanted to see you in your practice, how might they do that?
Absolutely. So I work with Northwestern Medicine in the north suburbs of Chicago. You can just look me up on the Northwestern Medicine website, and that's where they can find me to see me.
You're doing fantastic work, my friend. This is inspiring.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on the new cookbook.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Go out and get it, everyone. I'm assuming it's available on Amazon too.
Anywhere books are sold.
Yeah. Okay. Most excellent. All right. Thank you. Hey, folks. Okay. Back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switch4good.org. That's podcast@switch4good.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the Switch for Good, please visit us at switch4good.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to Switch for Good. This is the future.